Now, speaking of that, let's move on to this part, and let's put this up there on the screen. This is something that we have been focused on very intently. So you guys might have seen this, but the Ukrainian government has been putting out all sorts of these propaganda videos of them striking Crimea targets. So Russian arms depots and others using specifically US-provided weapons. Now, here's the reason why that mattered, which is that Crimea, of course, taken by force and annexation by the Russians in 2013. They later, confirmed it as some sort of like plebiscite. And they're like, the people of Crimea want to be part of Russia. So anyway, Russia regards it as its own territory, as an official part of the Russian Federation. So, of course, this is contested in international, circles, never recognized by the United States, never recognized by Ukraine, by Europe, by any international body. That being said, this is still the first strike by Ukrainians. Now, of course, they consider it their territory. So that being said, they're using our weapons to strike this territory, which the Russians consider part of the Russian Federation. I'm not saying that's not a reason to do it, only that it does change the stakes a little bit in terms of past fears by the United States and by many others that the Ukrainians would actually use US-provided weapons to strike other ammo depots and other things in actual Russia across from the border, or at least traditional Russia, pre-2013 Russia, and that could be regarded as an escalation on behalf of the United States. And now we do know, after the State Department was pressed, that the United States has approved of these strikes, of Ukrainian strikes on Russian-occupied Crimea. Here's what they said, quote, "We don't select targets, of course, and everything we've provided is for self-defense. Any target they choose to pursue on sovereign Ukrainian soil is by definition self-defense." So, of course, we're sticking with our definition. Now, listen, I am obviously partial to this definition, but the other side gets a vote too. And so this could lead to some escalation on their behalf. Or, look, it could just lead to some things that we really don't want to see, and which we've seen in the past. Anytime the Russians feel like the West is moving in a certain direction, they'll strike Lviv, or they'll strike Kyiv for no particular reason, with these horrific weapons and, bomb, a bunch of civilians. This could lead to also some sort of strike back in that regard. But I just think it's very, very noteworthy for us to see very specifically that we are supportive as official Biden administration policy of US-provided weapons being used by Ukraine to strike targets in Crimea, which also is very sensitive from a diplomatic point of view on our end, which is that the Ukrainians, Zelensky specifically, has said, we're going for it all. We will never cede Crimea. Listen, I'm sympathetic. I wouldn't do it either. Now, though, does that mean, though, that the war is going to drag on for years and years? These people, frankly, so far, have not even been able to retake territory in the eastern part of Ukraine that they already lost.
Yeah.
How are you going to take back Crimea? You're already still fighting a defensive war. And even the New York Times, Krystal, put a story out this morning, almost as kind of like a calm down folks type thing to its major supporters. They were like, hey, these strikes that are happening on Crimea, they're mostly for social media purposes, and they will have very limited effect. Russians actually keep most of their ammo depots outside of the range of Ukrainian weapons, so don't think that this is making some major effect on the war. So I found it very, very telling that the Times felt the need this morning to come out with an update to all of its readers to just say, hey, this is not like any major strategic new offensive by the Ukrainians.
Right.
It's mostly a social media campaign.
Well, and it should be seen, too, in the context of the fact that the Ukrainians have been signaling for a while that they're going to have this new major counteroffensive, which we have not actually really seen. And so perhaps this is a way to create some splashy headlines that give the illusion of some sort of progress and capability to retake territory even beyond the line, the sort of status quo before the latest Russian invasion. So that it's mostly for social media purposes kind of makes sense in that regard. But I also do think it's worth keeping in mind that this is very serious. The policy of the U.S. government had been sort of, it had been very left intentionally unclear whether Crimea and the parts of eastern Ukraine that had already been taken by Russia before this latest invasion, whether striking in those regions was considered defensive, whether we were okay with our missiles being used for those purposes or not. Now they're clarifying that it is. And I mean, it is hard not to describe that as an escalation, because it's saying, okay, we don't want to just retake the territory that we had before this most recent invasion. We want to actually go all the way back, even though, you know, the real facts on the ground, even though they weren't fully acknowledging that, hey, you know, Russia has taken these places over, the facts on the ground were they had these parts of eastern Ukraine and they had Crimea. Nobody was really doing a lot to try to, especially in Crimea, take that territory back. So I think it's hard not to characterize this as an escalation and, you know, a major move forward in terms of the at least signaling maximalist aims of the Ukrainian government and backed by the U.S.
Let's put it this way. In 2016, you know, a couple years after Crimea, there's a hot war waging in the East. If Obama had shipped by the way, the major debate, and this is why I love actually knowing something about this, the major debate at that time was, should we provide the Ukrainians offensive weapons to, you know, contest territory in the eastern part of the country?
Yeah.
There was never even a debate around providing them with weapons to go after Crimea.
Right.
That would have been seen as like an effective declaration of war against the Russian state in 2016. And, you know, the debate was confined solely there. Now, of course, look, Russia invaded Ukraine. They're the ones who changed the game, not us. Now, though, we get to decide. We're like, hey, where diplomatically are we drawing lines here? You know, because if you start striking territory, which is, you know, disputed also in the past, well, you know, that opens up all sorts of doors as to what does this all mean. And look, it just does, what worries me about it is, if that's the aim, that's fine. You're welcome to fight your war. But our policy, and I'm doing my whole monologue on this, is effectively a blank check to Ukraine and say, you guys do whatever you want. And I don't think that that's acceptable, not when we provide the vast majority of the arms. And if we are going to be basically the sole funder of the Ukrainian military and the only reason that they exist, then I think we should have a say as to what's good for us. And to make sure you're like, hey, it's not actually in our interest that we have to keep providing you hundreds of billions of dollars of weapons for like a decade to fight over Crimea. We're like, you know, if you want to contest the East, fine, you know, be my guest, Odessa, etc. But we should have some say also in the prosecution of the war. Instead, we're taking a total backseat to what's happening there, which would effectively only guarantee that it goes on and on and on.
Yeah.
Again, you know, I'm not saying if I was Ukrainian, I wouldn't want Crimea back too. They get to decide, of course, and do what they want with their resources. But when we are the major funder, then we should also have a say as well. Yeah. And so what we think is good for us and for global peace, although I think what's good for us is first, always.
And yet again, another potentially highly consequential decision that will be seen as a provocation from Russia that is being taken with literally no public debate.
Yes.
Which has been the way of this entire war. Things are just done. The media doesn't explain what it means, what the risks are, what the possible blowback is. No, it's just presented as like, this is what we must do without any sort of case built on the other side for why there are risks involved in our course of action.
Very true.
Cable news is ripping us apart, dividing the country, making it impossible to function as a society, and making it impossible to know just what is true and what is false. But the good news is they are failing and they know it.
That is why we're building something new, a new mainstream, a healthier one, something more trustworthy, something that we are going to need in one of the most pivotal times in American history. We are building up here for the midterms, for the upcoming presidential election, but we need your help. So if you can help us out by becoming a premium member today at breakingpoints.com, we're trying to change America for the better and the entire world.
So what are you waiting for, guys? Go to breakingpoints.com and sign up and help us build a new mainstream.